for showing up. I'll do something that I usually don't, so please write down your name and emails, and you can expect a bonus point or two. If you want to pass that behind you. Your name and email, and I'll make a count at the end. Make sure you don't sign in for your buddies. What do you want to sign this? Okay, so a lot of material to cover today, but frankly, I don't really like the last chapter on consumption. Reads a bit like the authors needed some filling to reach 14 chapters. This material could probably have been covered and is to some extent covered in chapter 12, so I won't spend much time on the last chapter. And as usual, I've added other material on which you can expect to be quizzed, and I will let you know what you need to remember. Okay, so last week we discussed manufacturing. The following chapter is about the role of services in our modern economies, and services like manufacturing do exhibit some recurring patterns in terms of land use, in terms of where you find them. But obviously a lot has changed in the last few decades, roughly since the time you were born. I mean, I know that for you shopping online is nothing special, but I remember again how a number of people struggle with giving their credit card number on the website when that first appeared. A number of people were reluctant to do so. A lot of people also of a certain age liked to touch the material that they bought, and so even though there was something like the Sears catalog in an earlier age, most people who were used to shopping mall and having easy access to large retail outlets were a bit reluctant to convert to online shopping. Now the authors also obviously cover issues related to the governmental sector, so education, hospitals, and stuff like that, and we'll touch upon that briefly. Okay, so the problem with the service sector is that it's really residual activities in terms of not being primary or not being manufacturing activities. So this covers everything from flipping burgers at Harvey's to having a very lucrative job on Bay Street or working for an energy consulting firm. So the service sector is very diverse, and information and communication technologies have actually generated a number of very lucrative positions in the last few decades. The problem is that a lot of this is quote-unquote invisible, so you don't see this stuff transiting at container ports, and a lot of people don't get a sense of how much a country like the US, for the United States, for example, earns each year in terms of income from its service firm. So it's one thing to complain that, Mexicans or Chinese are destroying blue-collar jobs in the United States, but these economies also create a lot of well-paying service jobs in the United States that would not exist without international trade. And the rationale here being that firms that save money by shipping some manufacturing jobs in another country then can reinvest some of these resources in creating well-paying service jobs. And for a number of considerations, these are often based either in the business headquarters or at least in advanced economies, because this is where you have access to a pool of talent that can actually supply these positions. So as the author points out, it should have told me, I forgot to send it to the projector. Um, Anyway, you haven't missed much so far. I'm just sticking to basic definitions that are in the textbook. Did everybody sign in? So now that you've signed in, I expect you to stay until the end. Okay. So the service sector is not easy to define, and in many ways, even apart from being made up of quote-unquote residual activities, these activities are often hard to distinguish or to separate from either the primary or manufacturing sectors. So you can look at employment by broad sector groupings. This is the US and Canada over the last few decades. So 1970 and 2012 for the United States, 1970 and 2014 for Canada. So the number of jobs in the primary sector has declined a lot in the United States, much less so in Canada. That's because the energy sector kicked in and a number of jobs were created that did not exist before. In terms of manufacturing, the numbers went down. Now, truth be told, Canada looks a lot better than the United States here, but really this was an artifact of the Ontario economy, which remained more manufacturing heavy than a lot of sections of the United States, like for example the Midwestern state. But Ontario has been hurting these last few years, so if we were to look at that again, I don't think that Canada would look so good. Service total, though, has literally exploded these last few years. It's nearly tripled in both economies. Thank you. So if you're lucky enough to find a job that lives up to your aspirations once you get out of here, chances are you'll be working in the service sector. I used to say to some of your colleagues who were a bit depressed these last few years about the job prospects in Toronto to look at Alberta and Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is still doing okay, and you can still probably drive a truck for $120,000 a year if you're willing to go to remote areas, but beyond that, the prospects are not so great as they used to. Now again, I was telling you that the service sector really is about various activities. This is another breakdown, but I'm not going to get into the details of that. Okay, how should we think about space in terms of the service sector? Well, the standard practice is really to sort of abstract from reality and look at activities based on certain thresholds in terms of size and the range of space that these things cover. So once again, you've got a German fellow to blame for that, Walter Christaller. Now, something that is not mentioned in the textbook, and some things that geographers are really discreet about, is that Christaller had something of a shady past during the Second World War. So again, I don't know how many of you are history buffs or have taken a history class. I think that the class before this one is really about Nazi Germany and the Second World War. So Christaller was hired by the SS not to kill people, but the thinking then was that, okay, once you've removed the Slavs from Poland and other areas, how should we recolonize this area and put it good Aryan/German people in it? How should we organize the settlements? And that was kind of his job during the Second World War. So this is not something that geographers like to mention, but he came up with his theory, and the Nazis were actually willing to apply them in Eastern Europe. But anyway, this is a bit abstract, so I thought I would rather show you a video on this.
Yeah, this one goes out to my two OGs. That's outstanding geographers. Listen up. Central Place. Theory. Crystallis is my name and I stay learning cities. Ones that pull towards it, aka centrality. Hexagons are the most efficient. If that's all you know about CPT, that's insufficient. Circles don't do justice for us. Central Place. Voids and overlapping all the geographic space. Central Place got pulled all the way to the hinterlands, also known as economic reach, if you understand. Full assumptions must be made about a place before you can apply this theory to a space. Land is flat and populations are equal. Transportation's balanced and the soil is fertile. If commerce is beneath the CP's threshold, the Central Place withers, it is stressful. I classify regions from small to big. Hamlet, village, town, city, and megalopolis. Those are the facts that you gotta know. Oh yeah, White and Margulis, they run this show.
Okay, that's about as deep as I want to get into Kristallers' theory, to be honest. Again, there are a number of geographers who spend a lot of time doing this kind of stuff. It's never been my forte, and at any rate, it should probably be discussed in more details at a more advanced level. But anyway, so just to provide you another overview here, the Kristaller tried to determine the degree of centrality of various spaces. So if you try to connect that with reality in this country, think of Ontario, and then maybe Ottawa, and then maybe St. Catharines, Peterborough, London, towns like that. And so historically, when he wrote, when he had these ideas nearly a century ago, there was a definite urban order. But in recent years, obviously, information and communication technology has changed the role of places a lot. Okay, again, city, town, market, town, and again, why do you have an hexagon? Well, because you cover more area that way, and it makes, geometrically, it makes more sense than a square. So, distinct rules. Don't want to get into that. So historically, much retailing was concentrated in the centers. If you wanted a real shopping experience, you went to a large center, a large retail store. I'm told this is still true today in places like Saskatchewan, for example. So I was told this weekend that there are 2 Costco's in Saskatchewan, and that a lot of farmers and their family will drive 2 or 3 hours to go to Costco. But in that case, Costco has sort of become the central place because they go to Costco and not too many other locations. Whereas in the past, you had a number of anchor stores in the core areas of large cities. So again, the retail world has evolved a lot these last few decades, and the theory, I believe, is not as relevant as it might once have been. So this is from the textbook, The Evolution of the Canadian Retail System. If you're really interested in that kind of stuff, I would recommend the Marketing Geography course of my colleague, Joe Layden, whoever happens to be teaching it, if Joe isn't. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, you had the emergence of large retail stores, large department stores in the core of large cities. So today we have the Eaton Centre in Toronto, which is kind of a leftover that followed that era, but there was a big Eaton store at one point in time. People used to take the train, go shop there. The store would be 9 or 10 story high. Each level would be devoted to something in particular. Then the car came along, people moved to the suburbs, and as with manufacturing, which sort of moved out of multi-story buildings from downtown and moved to the suburbs, retail space moved to the suburbs and became really spread over 1 or 2, or if you really want to stretch it, 3 levels. So Square One, for example, at one point was an example of something like that. But over time you had new things emerging. Power retail centers. So if you go up to Mavis, close to the 401, you obviously are familiar with the type of stores that you find there. Again, 20 years ago, that wasn't all that common. Now, retail stores in downtown areas were like any other product. They were very unique at first. People used to shop at smaller places. They took the habit of going there. There was a period of growth. Alternatives developed, and they went out of fashions, or else their managers were able to convert them to something that is still appealing to a broad audience. Okay, you can expect a question on Eaton because it's such a Canadian icon. So I've provided a link on your syllabus on this, but what I will ask you to look at is the various interpretations as to how led to the decline of Eaton. So there is the video, but there is also below the video the story and a few words here that you should pay attention to. And I'm telling you that because you've been in class. So the video is one thing, but there's also this little blurb below. Okay?
Journalist Rod McQueen wrote about the Eaton family and the history of the company in his recent book called, quite sensibly, The Eatons. Rod McQueen joins me in the studio. Mr. McQueen, has the act come to an end with the announcement today? Just tell me what the announcement was and what it means.
Well, investment banker Scotia McLeod announced that they'd been retained by the Eaton company to put the for sale sign in the window. And yes, this is the denouement of the final act. The Eaton brothers, the four of them, still own 52% of Eaton's. They've also hired an investment banker, Rothschilds, to advise them. Now, the jargon is they're looking at their strategic options.
So do you think that this thing about enhancing shareholder values is puffery?
Yes, it is. Now, they would like that to happen at the same time. The share price is substantially down from where it started out almost a year ago at $15. It's down to about $4 a share now. They'd like to lift that up a bit, but basically what's happening is the for sale sign's in the window, and they're saying all those rumors that were around about people who are interested in buying us, come forward and make your best offer.
So I presume, and it's obvious, it's de facto now, that the great campaign of Christmas itself, the new marketing strategy, plugging into our hipper audience, that this was the rattle of the corpse?
It was an abysmal failure. They tried to go to the youth market with this whole diversity campaign aiming at the tweens, as they're called, 12 to 22, and they didn't come in the store. And meanwhile, all the people who had been loyal Eaton's shoppers over the years began to realize that that store wasn't really theirs anymore. I mean, they got out of so many product categories. They got out of candy. They got out of electronics. They got out of appliances. They got out of books. You can't even buy my book at Eaton's anymore.
They deserve to fail, obviously.
You no longer knew what was for sale in Eaton's, so you simply stopped going there.
Well, who's lining up for the pickings? Is it that some great American chains coming in here? Is this going all the way out of the country? Do we know who's interested? What's left to buy?
I think there are two basic possibilities here. There are 64 stores left across the country. They closed 21 in the last 2 years. One possibility would be a made in Canada kind of solution, which would see a consortium of Canadian companies come together, perhaps the Bay and Sears, maybe even Canadian Tire might like some of the smaller Eaton stores and buying the chain, or somebody like Federated out of the United States. They've got Macy's and Bloomingdale's. Whatever happens, if Federated comes into Canada, for example, I think they'd only be interested in the 20 main downtown and suburban locations. They would close the other 44 stores in the other locations.
So it is a matter of picking the plums and let the rest go. But is it also a signal that something of this kind of grand enterprise, is it because the time of those things is past and Canadians can't run great family businesses anymore? Or is it something very specific to the Eatons that brought this little calamity, at least cultural calamity about?
Well, it's a bit of both. Family businesses are difficult to run at the best of times because rather than picking the best person to run in 20 years' time, you're counting on the firstborn being the best person to run it. And in the case of the Eatons, they did very well. In fact, they got into the 5th generation. Some of the young men of the Eaton family who are now in their 30s are working in the stores. That's an amazing thing in Canada. But they just simply didn't have the marketing savvy to stay abreast of the competition.
Do you think, our crowd, media crowd, do you think we make too much of this? Is it the kind of sentimentalism that attaches to something that has a recognizable Canadian tag? Or is there really, truly, is there really some sort of moral in this or some sort of fable for us as a country or as a people?
Well, this was a great Canadian icon. Everybody grew up shopping at Eaton's, going to the Santa Claus parade, visiting Toyland. Everybody's got memories. You probably had an aunt who once worked there. Maybe you had a summer job there one summer.
We skipped Christmas at my house.
But this is the last family-owned Canadian business with the name on the door right across the country. And when this is sold, as it most certainly will be in the next 2 months.
Okay, I'll collect the papers at the end of class. Okay, please go back to your seats. There's no point doing that right now. Okay, so again, you re-listen to the video and you look at the blurb underneath and you'll find the answer that I'm looking for. Okay, so again, you're all familiar with power centers. These things have been around since you were old enough to begin shopping by yourself. But again, this is a recent development. They weren't really around. So whatever the futures may be, how much brick and mortar or concrete and steel beams or online shopping will eat into that remains to be seen. But I'm obviously someone who doesn't have much interest in shopping, so I'm obviously not a very good person to discuss that. Okay, the authors point out, among other things, that transportation costs are things that we don't really pay enough attention to. Obviously, when you buy things online, you might, for example, end up buying a book that will be shipped from the United Kingdom or some other place. These things eventually appear in your bill. If you shop on Amazon, as you know, you've got various pricing mechanism in terms of covering transportation costs. These are not things that we think about a lot, but we still need to move a lot of physical goods around through e-commerce. So if you get a job in logistics, you're likely to be employed in the long run, more than if you end up working in retail. Okay, central business districts, business organization, I'll skip that. Shopping clones. You've got a number of firms that are modeled on other firms. Some of these are, well, you've got a number of tea stores, for example, that are built on models that were first developed for fast food or for coffee. But obviously, it's like everything else. Some are more successful than others. They become brands, large brands. Others are purchased by others. One large brand might purchase another. So again, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chickens. I don't know how often you go to these places. Starbucks, can't afford that on my salary. But again, you can see why a successful model in one area would be replicated and adapted in another. Okay. The authors then spent a fair amount on tourism. Now, obviously, tourism is very diverse. You've got the package experience, you've got the eco-friendly experience, you've got the fear of traveling in some areas, you've got the notion of traveling on your own or following a group that covers a lot of ground. A number of economies depend to a large extent on tourism. In terms of the largest one, France, perhaps more than any other, depends on both large inflow of tourists each year and people from less interesting parts of Europe, or at least less interesting weather-wise, like the Netherlands or England, relocating to places like southwestern France, for example. In terms of producer services, I've hammered the notion of a value chain several times this semester. And again, what the authors point out at the beginning of their chapter and what they sort of insist again in another subsection is that it's a mistake to really think of the service sector as something standing on its own. It's like everything else. There are service firms that work very closely with manufacturing firms. So remember the logistic case regarding Ford Europe a few weeks ago, so that I showed you last week. So in some cases, these arrangements are short-lived. You know, there's a project or there's something that might last a few weeks or a few months, but there are some really interesting symbiosis relationships between different large businesses that will last for several years. So in that case, the relationship between the manufacturer and, let's say, the logistics or the accounting or the computers or the software servicing firms is much more akin to relational markets than a simple market where the manufacturer would go out and ask several firms to bid on particular projects. Okay. We're finally getting to what geography is all about. So services are no different, at least the high order services, the ones that are creative. We're not talking simple retail here, but you can obviously see geographical concentrations of related firms in geographical space. Now, this is most obvious in the financial sector. I mean, the few cities that still have a thriving financial sector still see it being heavily concentrated in a few areas. So if you go to Manhattan, for example, to New York, the financial service sector has geographically moved to a large extent from Wall Street to Midtown. This was required because of new needs in terms of information technology. You had more building space available in Midtown Manhattan, larger structures that were better served or better adapted to a modern financial sector, but you still have leftovers that are fairly significant around the New York Stock Exchange. You go to downtown Toronto, again, you see that Bay Street is still concentrating a lot of people in that industry. You also tend to see the same in theater districts. They tend to be concentrated within the same neighborhood in most cities that have significant theater districts. Conventional media is still heavily concentrated, so TV stations or TV production companies tend to be heavily concentrated. So in Calgary, there are a few blocks in downtown Calgary where if you want to be seen as a serious player in the service sector, you really need to have an office there. That's what I was told by people in Calgary. Don't ask me to name you the buildings or the particular intersection, but if you want to be seen as a serious player, you really need to be in the energy sector. You really need to be located in some of those buildings. So again, we live in an era where a lot can be done remotely, yet the need for face-to-face interaction, for meeting customers on a regular basis, or for having creative partnerships with people still requires physical proximity and a lot of face-to-face interactions. Okay, public services or government activities, if you want to call them that way, because it's less loaded, I don't know, are slightly different. They don't obey to the same kind of market logic than business activities do. So in theory, the governments could locate some activities anywhere, and they often do. So if you look for maximum security penitentiaries, for example, they can be located in any number of areas. In Quebec, one of the main Revenue Canada offices is located in the middle of nowhere in Shawinigan, because this used to be the riding of Jean Chrétien, if that tells you anything. You might be too young to know who he was. Let's just say he was powerful enough to have a lot of job being transferred to his riding, which is in central Quebec, but kind of far from other places. But at the same time, if you're going to build a university, if you're going to build a hospital, it often makes sense to locate them where people are. Although I don't know if I'm allowed to tell you this because I don't know if it's official, but in a way you might consider yourselves lucky, because as you might suspect, a number of universities in places like Thunder Bay or Nipissing are kind of struggling at the moment. So there are rumors that the provincial government will prevent this campus and other campuses from expanding to force some of your younger brothers and sisters to go up and save those universities in Northern Ontario. We'll see if that happens. But of course, if government were following a market logic, it might make more sense to close those universities and concentrate or expand operations in Southern Ontario. But that's, there are more member of parliaments up there than there are down here, and the issue is bigger and more important to them. So we'll see how that plays out. Okay. National variations in education and health. There are different achievements in terms of literacy and infant mortality rates. They're kind of fairly similar in advanced economies, but you have places like Cuba, for example, that report infant mortality rates that are very low and kind of out of sync with other poor economies. Whether they play with the numbers or present them in slightly different ways is a question that is open for debate. But the fact is that in theory, at least, education and health are part of the service sector. In some countries, they're mostly provided by the government, and others mostly by the private sector. And there is often much variation among states and even at the municipal level in the United States between, let's say, the quality of schools. And that's because pretty much all high schools in the United States, unless they're completely private, will be funded by the local taxpayers base. And so you might want to live in a particular neighborhood of a city rather than another to have access to that particular school. And some high school will have a lot more money than other parts of the city because it's really the local level that finances them. Okay, expenditures on school in the United States. So spending money is one thing, do you get results is another. I'm not gonna go there, but it's always interesting to see that some people seem to be able to do a lot more with less resources, or at least doing as good as others. Accessibility and efficiency, again, central place hierarchy is still kind of relevant, at least for government ministries. And there's been something of a concentration of those over time. Okay, I apologize if I went quickly over that, but you can expect a question on Eaton and things based on the textbook. Okay, the last two chapters are about transportation and communication networks and consumption. I will spend more time on transportation because, again, I believe it is directly relevant in the context of an economic geography class, whereas the consumption chapter is really, I don't know, something that I believe could have been incorporated in their service chapter. Okay, Harold Dennis, if you've ever heard of Innis College downtown, well, that's him. Famous Canadian economic historian, but who recognized the importance of geography and how it shaped economic development. So we have a quote at the beginning of the chapter: geography has been effective in determining the grooves of economic life through its effect on transportation and communication. So he worked in an era where you could still write in plain English if you were doing economics. You were not, doing one model after another. And as a result of this and the fact that he worked a lot on Canadian economic development, he came to recognize early on, for obvious reasons, that in a country like Canada, geography is pretty much key to everything, and that transportation does really matter. So the authors kind of follow his lead in their chapter, and so they discuss things like the fixed costs and scale economies in network operations, government regulations, and also the environmental costs of network. Again, there's a lot of material to be covered. I'm going to skim over most of it, and I will tell you something that will be relevant at one point that isn't in the chapter per se. But first, in order to make the chapter a bit more interesting, I threw in a lot of material on my own. So, in the last 200 years, the world has undergone nothing short than a transportation revolution. So, civilization has been around for several thousand years, but throughout most of human history, what we sometimes call in geography the friction of distance was really significant. So, moving goods over land was very difficult. Moving goods over water wasn't so easy, and while the cost would be lower, getting a lot of goods from point A to point B over water would take a long period of time. And so the cost of moving people and also information could not travel faster than people and goods, was significant. But what has happened in the last 2 centuries is that everything was slow for a very long time. Then economies really took off, and that was to a large extent the result of better transportation technologies. So sail ships were significant in the 16 and 1700s. Then better digging technologies came along, so nitroglycerin, TNT and dynamite and stuff like that. The railways, for the first time in human history, allowed people to move things speedily and in large volumes over land. Then the car came along, highways were built, so roads were no longer basically dirt paths. They became paved in order to allow cars to move in large numbers. And obviously airports. It's hard to imagine that the Wright brothers flew there, I don't know, could we call it a glorified kite, slightly above a century ago, and see how much has changed since then. So, why have costs fallen so much in the last few decades? Please remember this: containerization, bulk shipping, and air transport. So containerization is the idea of putting a lot of stuff in boxes that are very easy to move, as opposed to smaller boxes of things where you have to move either a bunch of boxes wrapped together or even smaller items. Now, containers have basically all the same shape, but they come in different sizes, as you can see here. So typically 20 feet or 40 feet. I'll revisit those things. So again, as I never tired of saying, land transportation was a problem in the past. Moving anything good over dirt roads most of the year was a problem. So I like to show that one. I show that in a number of my courses, but for those who have never seen you, these are people trying to deliver relief food during a famine in China about a century ago. So again, you can see how moving large quantities of good over land was difficult, and here there's a huge demand. People are starving, and yet that's the most that 3 people can carry. Now, this is not too far from the St. George campus in 1914. Again, you can understand the dynamic that the car brought in terms of paving roads. Road pavement came along as a result of leftovers in the energy sector, at first coal gas manufacturing and then petroleum refining. I discussed those in more detail in another class of mine, but again, try to imagine driving in those conditions, or in that case, having your horse carriage. Now obviously you can move something that is not too heavy, and horse carriages were designed to have big wheels, and assuming that the potholes were not too big, you might get from point A to point B without braking too much. But again, try to imagine moving heavy goods in large volumes over something like that. Now, there were a few exceptions historically. So one civilization that built the road was ancient Rome, but you can see how narrow they were, and that's because their roads were not designed so much for commerce as for moving large amounts of troops, large numbers of soldiers over the territory that Romans occupied. So, I mean, they had a number of legionnaires, but still not all that many, but they held their empire together by being able to move them quickly over land, and that's why they built roads. They could be used for commerce also, and so there was more commerce in Roman times than afterwards. But still, I mean, these are sort of the top-notch roads in the world 2,000 years ago. But usually in most places, again, there's only so much that you could move, and this is a good day here, so but imagine that most of the year the thing is either frozen, which wouldn't be too bad, or else muddy or wet or filled with holes and what have you, and you understand the problems of moving goods over land. And so you wanted to move small quantities of goods and have animals who could handle bad road conditions. So 2 ways of moving things: pack on your back. The best pack animals historically were the camels. They could move over very rough terrain and could carry a lot more weight than a horse. And you also had draft technology, so again, people pulling things, but obviously in most cultures, people would rather have used other animals to move things around. Okay, so again, reindeers, you can imagine that thing here. The best land option historically, though, was paradoxically to have a navigable river whose current was not too strong, or even better than that, to dig a canal whose water level would be reliable and again would not have much current on it. So you can see how much a single horse can pull on a canal, as opposed to, again, think of the dirt road that I showed you before. how little you could carry on this. So in the late 18th century, one horse could carry 125 kilogram on its back as a pack animal. If you had a decent road, 2,500 kilograms, but 30 tons if pulling a barge along a river, and up to 50 tons if a barge in a quiet canal. So this is a canal. So that's why if you ever go to countries in Europe or in the northeastern United States and you wonder, well, why did people bother digging canals instead of using land transportation? That's why. Okay, river, sea, and ocean transportation. So historically, you wanted to move goods over long distances. You can pack a lot of goods on a boat that floats, assuming that you can get it to where you want to go. It was much more economical than land transportation. So while people often think of Roman roads when they think of the Roman Empire, most of the trade actually took place by boat. And again, it sort of makes sense for obvious economic reasons. Now, Northern Europe was revived by trade in the between, let's say, the 13th and the 17th century by connecting various portions of what we now call England, Norway, Denmark, all the way to Russia around the Baltic Sea here. Baltic Sea is kind of a big brackish lake. I mean, it's salted, but not too salty, and it's not that deep. It's not that difficult to navigate, and so there was a lot of trade there, and a number of cities rose as a result. Okay, bottom line, I'll ask you to remember this. So before the 19th century, the long distance trade was limited. Cities typically did not cover more than 20 square kilometers in terms of size, and that's because that's about as much as people would walk. Cities were built around walking. Yes, of course, rich people might have horses, or other people might have donkeys, but most people could not afford to keep an animal in a city because you had to feed it and you had to buy animal feed every day. So most people walked everywhere, and when people walk, you can see that historically cities tend to be very compact. The trade in perishable commodities, so not wheat, not dry cod, not salted meat, but again, vegetables, dairy products, fresh meat. All of that tended to be limited to about 50 kilometers from the city at most, again, because transportation was so bad. And so the emphasis, and I won't ask you to remember those, the only things that would travel long distances, think of a caravan road, the Silk Road or something like that, were goods that were very high value and non-perishable. So spices, especially when meat quality was pretty bad, you know, you would sort of swallow it but throw a lot of spices on it. Silk, perfume, precious metal, jewelries. And in terms of the ship trade or maritime trade, things like grains, olive oil, and wine and salt. And in Northern Europe, the Hanseatic League that I was just showing you, so grain, salt, wine, wool, timber, and stone. Again, you might think, well, why would people be moving rocks around? Well, it's like everything else. There are better rocks than others, and if you want to build a cathedral or something special, like let's say the Parliament building in Ottawa. The Parliament building in Ottawa is actually not built of Canadian stone. It's built from sandstone that came from upstate New York. That's because people liked the color, it was easy to work with, it was durable, so not all stone is created equal. But all I want you to remember is the emphasis on high value and non-perishables. Okay? Okay, so the steam engine comes along, and it's such a great technology that it is adapted to transportation, both on land and on water. And again, that's an image that some of you have seen before. I'm never tired of showing it. So you can see how much a train carries in the 19th century, heavy goods, and the poor farmer struggling on his muddy road. So again, you can imagine, by looking at this, how significant the railroad was historically. Now, steamboats were used to go up the Mississippi River in the United States. The Mississippi River basically flows from Minnesota and the Great Lakes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It might not look powerful when you cross it over the bridge, but going upstream over long distances was very difficult historically, so people did not do it until they had a technology that could go on against the current for several hours, several days at a time. So the steamboats that were created in the 19th century in the United States to go up the Mississippi were very flat. That's because we're not very deep, because the Mississippi tend to be shallow in many areas. But for the first time, you could go upriver economically, and so you could open up, you could bring things like coffees and banana to places like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, which is not something that you could do before. Again, it's another image. Steamships, as opposed to steamboats, refer to things that cross oceans. So the first steamships look like sailboats to which a steam engine has been added. That's because if you knew how to navigate with sails, and if that was useful to you, if that was worth the trouble, you would burn less coal in the project. But pretty soon people realized that sails are a waste of time. They require a lot of main power, and yes, the wind might be a renewable resource, but it's not a very effective one compared to steam engines, and so that's why sail disappeared. So you always have people who come up in the name of sustainable development with these notions of, well, why don't we put sails back on ships? Well, been tried, not worth the trouble, which is why people got rid of them. Okay, this is a bit of a cultural break. I don't know how many of you ever saw that movie, Battleship Potemkin. It's a very famous communist propaganda movie from the 1920s that describe events, or that weaves a story around events that occurred 2 decades before, in 1905, in what is now the Black Sea. And if you follow the news about Crimea these last couple of years, this is where the story takes place. But what's interesting about the movie is that it describes how people used to burn coal instead of diesel in the ship. And the little segment that I will show you shows you how much pollution there was associated with coal, and how people used to communicate from one ship to another before they had communication means that allowed them to communicate electronically without having a wire connecting things. So it's a few minutes. This was a silent movie, so some people recently added some creepy music over it, but I just find it an interesting historical document. So again, look at the pollution and the way people communicate. That's what I find interesting as well. People used to communicate with both signals, with little flags and big flags. That would be a normal day at the office. In terms of pollution. So again, it's one thing to worry about the smog problem in Toronto, but that gives you an idea of how bad things really were a century ago. So this is what the amount of smoke and pollution that was required to power a ship. But a city like Toronto that ran on coal a little bit over a century ago would have had, a lot more smoke than this. So you can sort of imagine what air pollution once used to look like in a place like this. It was worse than China today. Okay, so transportation historically, again, when you have sailboats that are made out of wood, you're limited in terms of how big your ship can be and where you can navigate. I've been over that before, but the sail ship routes, again, are in white here. And that's because you cannot really sail against the wind economically, even though there is a way to do it. And you want to take advantage of maritime currents. But once steel boat powered by coal come along, yes, they're more pollutant. They're much more polluting, obviously. But again, you can go anywhere, anytime, and that's the real appeal of steamships. So once navigation really takes off with the modern technologies, there is an incentive to build the Panama and the Suez Canal, among others, because you can negotiate them a lot more quickly than in the past. So going up the Red Sea, for example, using a sailboat would have been a slow and tedious process. You have a steamship coming through, you know when you're going to enter, you roughly know how long it will take you to reach the canal, and so it made sense to increase traffic and build canals along the way. Okay, so transportation costs are lowered drastically in terms of water. The freight rates go down by more than 40% between 1870 and 1913, and inland probably a lot more than that. But in that case, it depends on the route and are you crossing a mountain or not, so that's why coming up with a simple number is more difficult. Okay, so you saw again how polluting coal was. Coal has another problem. It's a solid, so you basically need to shovel the thing. If you have a liquid form of energy, you can just open a tap and the thing will flow from one tank to another. And diesel also packs more of a punch in terms of energy content per unit of volume, and so naturally over time diesel engines came to replace coal-powered steam engines. But of course, we still use coal today, but the point is that we use diesel-powered locomotives to deliver coal to places like electric power stations. Okay, so as with everything else, things improve over time. That tells you how diesel-powered transoceanic ships, and before them, coal-powered steamships, how many days they would take to cross the Atlantic between northern England and Liverpool to New York City. So almost 3 weeks when the first steamboat comes along in the 1830s, and it's down to less than 4 days by the 1950s. Okay, bulk shipping, as I was mentioning before, if you're not familiar with that, bulk shipping is when you don't move boxes called containers between ships, but rather large volumes of a single commodity, so be it petroleum, grain, cement, coal, or what have you. So bulk ships typically have a number of compartments like this that are isolated from each other. And so it can be, you fill them with petroleum, you fill them with coal, you fill them with something else. Cement, so if you've ever looked at how they're building things in downtown Toronto, the cement often comes in by ship, because it makes a lot more sense to bring it by water than bringing it by land. Ro-ro, mentioned that, low break bulk. Okay, so historically, there were a number of government regulations that prevented the natural integration of the transportation system. That's because politicians were trying to protect the railroads. They were also trying to protect the trucking industry, and you could not allow a company, or it was not, if you were an entrepreneur, feasible to buy two companies and merge them because they complemented each other. There was a lot of regulations to protect jobs and what have you. The idea of intermodal shipping has obviously been along for a long time. So barrels used to be round, for example, so that you could move them easily on the ground. Barrels are very heavy, and putting them on wheelbarrows wouldn't make sense. So of course, they naturally came to have a shape that allowed people to roll them and move them up and down boats, among other things. Amphoras in the ancient past were often standardized. They would all have the same size and shape and volume so that you could stack them easily within a ship. Again, it's not because you were operating a small wooden boat that you wouldn't try to be as efficient as possible. So based on the wrecks that were found, we know how people tried to maximize their use of space in ancient time. But of course, some goods need to be transferred between one mode of transportation and another. So this is bananas. These are bananas from a century ago. You want to move them from where they're being collected to the train station. And because bananas could be shipped over long distances, then you needed to transfer them from the train into a ship that would typically leave Central America and end up in the United States not too long after that. Now, before container shipping came along, people would move a bunch of boxes, even though they might have been wrapped together using cranes, either on a ship or on the dock here. But the result of that inefficient way of moving things was that ships would often spend more time being loaded and unloaded than on the water. And so obviously that didn't make any sense from an economic perspective. Something better had to be found. And eventually the idea of stacking metallic boxes, mostly aluminum boxes today, sort of emerged and became dominant. So what happens now, so this was the first container ship ever. This is the fellow that more than any other was responsible for developing modern container shipping. So Malcolm McLean. He found his way around the government by coming at this originally from the trucking industry, but he was not allowed to buy a shipping company that would ship things along boat. So what he did, he sold his trucking company, moved in shipping, but had a number of secret deals with his friends in the trucking industry, so that separate businesses in theory kind of operated like one business in practice. So when there's a will, there's a way. And today we have obviously very large container ships that are in and out of ports within a matter of hours, and that spend, as they should, most of their times between different locations than on and being loaded and unloaded. Okay, so.
Music says 2017 will be.
This is something, again, that some of you might have seen in my other courses.
In 1956, a ship retired from the Second World War was rechristened the SS Ideal X. On her first voyage, she left Port Newark, New Jersey. 5 days later, she arrived in Houston, Texas. On board were 58 large metal boxes. Today, we would call them containers. In Texas, they were loaded onto 58 trucks and whisked off to their various destinations. It was the birth of modern container shipping. The idea seems so simple today, yet it revolutionized the shipping industry, and with it, the global supply chain. Globalization, as we understand it today, simply would never have existed without it. This is what a port looks like before containerization. This is Sunda Kelapa in Jakarta. Even today, many ports don't have the facilities to accommodate large container vessels or the dockside equipment to unload boxes at speed. This is how a modern port looks today. Metal containers have transformed the loading process. Boxes are moved on and off ships by special cranes in a matter of minutes. From the port side, they are transferred to rail or truck. Container ships are getting bigger and bigger. Today, the largest transport not 58 metal boxes, but up to 18,000. Some ships...
Okay, so familiar with this, but just wanted to refresh your memory on that. Now, what's really interesting, though, is the integration of all these activities. So the BBC video that I showed you and that I mentioned before followed one box, but it's interesting to see how one company, DHL in that case, can integrate the whole thing. So this is not as good a video as I would like it to be, but in terms of length, it was perhaps the most appropriate. So
As the world's leading logistics company, DHL provides best-in-class supply chain solutions to its customers through its DHL International Supply Chain Management Solution. Managing customer supply chains on a global scale, DHL is the perfect partner for multinational companies of all sizes. Our facilities and employees across the globe are strategically positioned to manage your logistics effectively.
DHL is a global market leader in the logistics industry. We provide innovative, customized supply chain solutions to our customers worldwide, enabled by best-in-class service coupled with leading-edge technology. We have a strong worldwide presence with more than 850 locations, including warehouses and offices in 150 countries. We have over 30,000 highly qualified employees across the world and are well positioned to meet the needs of our customers.
With a global distribution network, DHL is a market leader and a key business partner to our customers that offers global connectivity across borders and regions. At DHL, our operation excellence has set new standards in the industry. From solution design, implementation to operations, processes are orchestrated to provide the optimal end-to-end solution for our customers. With globalization, increasing supply chain complexity and the need for speed, adaptability, accuracy, and timeliness, DHL operates the state-of-the-art purchase order management system, a platform capable of receiving customers' purchase order information and providing unit-level visibility and critical milestones across the end-to-end supply chain. This fully integrated system allows customers to have real-time information for all international shipments across the globe. The systemic platform is supported by a specialist trained team, providing dynamic cost and lead time optimization, performance, KPI reporting, and ongoing recommendations, proactively reacting to changes in the supply chain.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. If you're interested in seeing the rest of the video, it's linked on your syllabus. Okay, advantages of containerization. Please remember this. Obviously, the transportation costs and time went down remarkably, enhanced reliability, reduced pilferage and theft, and slash insurance prices. So again, you take for granted when you walk into a Walmart or a Power Center or, I don't know, an ethnic grocery store, that the stuff is there, it's affordable, you don't expect those stores to run out of stuff. But again, there is an industry behind it all. There's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of trial and error that went on over the years. And the end result is the modern logistics industry, which again is something that I believe not enough people appreciate, and we tend to take it for granted. But the reason why things are a lot cheaper and more abundant today than a few decades ago owes a lot to the logistics industry, just as much as new manufacturing technologies and new ideas in terms of goods and products. Okay? Now, air cargo today is a bit like camel transportation in the past. In a way, it's moving the sort of most valuable goods, but today, of course, they tend to be not only highly valuable, but also highly perishable. So fancy flowers, for example, fresh seafood of premium quality, these kinds of things will be typically moved by airplane rather than ships. And that's because even though a ship can cross the Pacific Ocean in a few days, and even though the modern logistic supply chain is well worked out, even though they can move a lot of things quickly, there are some products that are perishable enough that you want to sell them as soon as possible, and they're valuable enough to be shipped in much smaller containers that you can load on an airplane. So there is no such thing as break bulk on a plane. Things are moved into smaller containers, which are then loaded onto planes. And most of these things actually move through passenger airlines, not through specialized cargo planes. Now, this is why sometimes if you're on an airplane that is of a reasonable size, but that is not too full in terms of passengers, you perhaps should not feel too bad for the company because they might be carrying a lot of cargo that day. So, okay. Now I'm back. Now I'm off to what I wanted to add to the textbook. Now I'm back into what Ater and Pachel want you to learn. Now, there are significant sunk costs in terms of our transportation infrastructure, and the networks that we have today might not necessarily be optimal in terms of where people now live and the type of things that need to be moved around, which is why you need to build more infrastructure. Now, there are countries like China where I'm told building a new port really is a matter of days, and you do that easily. In advanced economies, expanding existing operation is often met with a lot of opposition. So there was Los Angeles, for example, in the United States was historically not a very good location to build a port. If you've ever been to California, you've got two locations that are really good in terms of building port facilities. There's San Francisco in the north and San Diego in the south. There's a reason why the U.S. Navy has such a huge base if you ever visit San Diego. But Los Angeles was basically a beach. Now, a beach is nice if you just want to go swim in the water, but in terms of getting ships to come to shore, this is highly problematic because the water was too shallow and the area was not really protected when you would have storms and stuff like that. But because Los Angeles grew much faster than San Diego and San Francisco in the 20th century, there was an incentive to build a huge port in an area called Long Beach. But the whole thing had to be man-made, and a lot of disturbance was created with the local environment. Now, a few decades ago, people didn't used to care about that all that much. They would look at the economic benefits and be happy with that. But with the rise of China and the fact that a lot more goods came from across the Pacific, there was a need to expand all ports on the US West Coast, and obviously Los Angeles was expanded too, but there was a lot of opposition to that. But again, there are trade-offs that need to be made. So would you rather concentrate all the impact in one or a few locations or build other facilities elsewhere? So as long as people want to buy stuff, there'll be a need for port facilities. Okay. Networks, economies, and externalities. So again, there are, if you ever take the train between, let's say, Toronto and Montreal, you will see as you get close to Montreal, the train, the VIA, still goes by a big container facility. You will see a lot of containers before you go into downtown Montreal proper. And that's because, again, this facility was built, or at least this area was built for something else. It's an old industrial land that's been occupied for something like 2 centuries. So this is not too problematic, and there are economies of scale in terms of having it there because the infrastructure was built and nobody really wanted to rebuild on contaminated ground. But dumping containers is something that people can do. But there are problems when you have greenfield development and you want to build a container facility. So again, the reason why people want to concentrate activities is that there are quote-unquote positive externalities that benefit a lot of people when things are concentrated with each other. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that there are trade-offs, and again, humans will always have an impact. If you want to improve standards of living, more stuff will need to be built, but you might as well concentrate the impact in a few locations than spread them over several smaller locations. And positive externalities explain why things spontaneously tend to concentrate in a few locations. Okay, network economies and externality continued. Yeah. That's getting a bit complicated here. So what the authors do next is discuss the notion of a network in more abstract terms. They apply that to both e-commerce and the old-fashioned business of moving physical goods around. But they point out that networks emerge in order to facilitate transactions and minimize cost. I'm just not sure how much I want to get into that. So figure 13.1 describes network, but don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on that. But the point is that it makes sense to have a few central locations, and if you got a hint from that, from the DHL video, it makes sense to have big warehouses, big facilities, concentrate stuff that, and then distribute things in other locations. So hub airports, if you ever fly in the United States to a smaller city, not to a large one, I mean, people don't realize the importance of hub airports in Toronto because we are a hub. We have Pearson Airport, and from Pearson you can fly pretty much anywhere in the world. But if you live in a smaller city, let's say in the Maritime Provinces or in Sudbury or some other location, if you want to fly anywhere, you need to fly through Toronto first. And that's because the logic of a transportation network makes it much more convenient to concentrate operations in a big part from which you can then dispatch people to other locations. People are good. So you have a few hubs in the United States. You have Detroit, if you've ever flown on Northwest, or as it used to be known, Non-Worth airline. Denver, Atlanta, increasingly Dallas in the south, obviously Los Angeles. There are a few airports that really you cannot avoid if you want to go anywhere in terms of a smaller town in the United States. So
The UK needs growth. Growth means trade, and that means connecting with the world's new markets. One way to connect is to have every destination connect with every other, but that's very inefficient. The best way to connect is via a hub. A hub connects destinations with each other in a way they couldn't on their own. A hub lets a small place like Dyce in Scotland connect with large places like China or Brazil, and vice versa. Hub airports attract business. In fact, they're just about the most efficient way any business here can get connections out there. Hubs can only work with large numbers of people going through them, because only large passenger numbers justify airlines providing more flights or flights to new places. Serving these connecting passengers makes direct flights to new business destinations available to all of us in the UK. Hub airports are crucial for growth. That's why Europe is investing in them. Heathrow is the UK's hub airport. And if the UK doesn't invest in new connections through it, you know where the growth will go.
So again, that's not very subtle attempt at promoting the growth of Heathrow Airport. The problem is obviously people who live near Heathrow per se, which is in London. If you've ever been there, unlike Toronto, they're actually connected on their subway system. the thing with a place like Heathrow is that it generates a lot of traffic, both in terms of planes landing and departing from the airport, but obviously in terms of people going to and from the airport and all the logistics industry that is around it. So that's good if you want to be in business, but if the airport is kind of expanding into your residential neighborhood, you might not be so pleased with that. So there are always trade-offs, but in the long run, I mean, there are potential technological solutions. So airplanes today are a lot less noisy than they were in the past. So that's one thing. You can tell planes not to land between midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning. If you live north of here, maybe some of you do. I mean, I've never visited those houses, but obviously you can have better windows that insulate you from the noise. So your neighborhood might be noisy, but your house might be relatively quiet. So again, there are billions of us on Earth. A few billion are still quite poor. People want to improve their standards of living. It's hard to do more with less in terms of moving goods, but usually people who don't want to live next to an airport don't live next to an airport. You might want to live next to an airport because there are jobs, because you want to cut down on your commute, because now according to some studies you actually have more jobs around Pearson Airport than in downtown Toronto. So some people are willing to put up with that, other people are not. I believe that's what urban markets are for. People will find themselves where they want. The problem is when an airport grows and moves into an area where people have been established for a long time and they might have been willing to put up with some traffic congestion, but perhaps not anymore. So again, that's what markets are for, allowing people to express their preferences. And if that doesn't work, there's always politics, which might not always work. Okay, networks analysis and design. Again, I think that little video gave you the real insight that you need to know for a second-year course anyway. It makes a lot more sense to have people go through a hub than try to connect every small location on Earth. Now, there are companies like Bombardier that make smaller jets, and the idea was that they would be connecting small cities to small cities. But obviously the cities need to be big enough to justify connections without going through a hub. So there's always a belief that these markets will emerge. In some cases it does make sense, but the logic of the hub is very strong. And while you might see growing smaller cities that can have somehow a connection with each other and can justify smaller airplanes flying between them, for most people a hub is still a necessity. So again, traffic around Pearson sucks pretty much every time of the day now, but we need it if Toronto is going to grow. So modes and intermodality, logistics, I've already covered that. Location imperative, network externality, I mentioned that. Government ownership and regulation. See, don't worry, you're not going to be quizzed on that. I'm trying to be nice to you here. Interurban networks, land use planning. Transportation networks and the environment. Okay, so this is a tricky one. Again, you can see the direct impact of more traffic. But the point of showing you the Battleship Potemkin video was to show you that it's not only the volume of goods that transit on the sea, it's also the technology that is used to move them around. So yes, modern container ships are not the cleanest thing in the world, and that's because in order to save costs and because they have big engines, they will typically burn the lowest quality fuel. There is such a thing known as bunker fuel, which, again, if you've taken my energy course, you might know this already, but when you have a barrel of oil coming out of the ground, if you let it rest a bit, petroleum is made out of different fractions, and the lighter stuff will naturally float to the top, the heavier stuff will come at the bottom. The bottom is what is used to make asphalt. The top one will include gasoline, among other things, which you put in your car. But there is the sort of diesel fraction in there, and there are various grades in it, and the heaviest, dirtiest ones are the ones that we use in container shipping because it's cheaper and because it's still fairly polluting. So the way container ships operate is that they typically have two tanks. I mean, they will have or they will have a large quantity of bunker fuel, which they will burn once they're in the high seas, because there's a lot of sulfur coming out of the ship. And when they get closer to port, what they typically do is that they switch to a cleaner fuel, so that you don't have the same pollution problems close to cities. Now, a number of people would like container ship to stop burning the dirty stuff when they're in the open sea. But again, there is a trade-off. If they were to buy cleaner quality fuel, they would have to pay more. And then who else would burn the low quality stuff? And at the same time, when you're out in the ocean, well, the oceans are big and they can sort of absorb the sulfur that comes through that, and it does not affect wildlife all that much, or at least that's the theory. I'm no expert on these things, but that's what people in the logistics industry will tell you. But there is obviously an environmental cost to be paid that way, but you cannot have an electricity-powered container ship. There's a reason why petroleum products completely dominate the transportation sector. You only find electric trains close to large cities. That's because moving electricity across wires or across transmission lines is very expensive. And as soon as you leave large cities, trains are still powered by diesel engines. And if you ever travel by train along the eastern seaboard in the United States, if you travel between Boston and Washington, the trains are powered by electricity, but as soon as you leave Washington and you're not, in the middle of nowhere, if you want to go from Washington to Miami, you will see that in Washington they replaced the electric engine by a diesel engine. And that's because there is not enough population south of Washington to justify electrifying the system. And of course, if you send trains across the United States in places that are empty, it just doesn't make sense to build an electric network. And of course, when you're out at sea, there's just no possibility to power a container ship with electricity. The power density, I don't want to get into the details, but again, 95% of transportation in the modern world is powered by petroleum products. And there's a reason for that, and there are no other alternatives in the short run. So while container ships might be polluting, thinking that the giant battery technology could solve the problem is just not realistic in the current state of technology anyway. Okay, consumption. Okay, I'm tired, so are you. The one thing I'll ask you to remember, and I'll skip all of that, is the long tail phenomenon. You can expect a question on this. So why, among other reasons, did online shopping replace bricks and mortar stores? Well, the reason why Amazon stayed in business, even though they lost money for a very long time, is that they offered a wider variety of goods to consumers. Now, there are less and less conventional bookstores, and you go in there now and they sell mugs, they sell coffee, they sell all sorts of other things. But there used to be big bookstores that used to sell nothing but books and large volumes of books. But obviously the logic of a bookstore, even though there might have been some snob appeal to it, was to sell what people were most likely to buy. Now, an extreme example of that today would be something like Costco. Costco sells books, but obviously they sell things that will turn over a lot. They don't keep specialty books that will be sold, maybe once a year or something. And so what the big conventional bookstores used to do was that they would store, obviously, the most popular book. It's like any other retail business. You don't want to use valuable shelf space for stuff that doesn't sell. But one advantage that Amazon had when it first came along is that it could give people quick access to stuff that was very difficult to find. And the system was configured in such a way that people who used to have to go physically to a bookstore and file a request with the bookstore owner so that he would try to find the thing and order it from another bookstore elsewhere would take forever. But something like Amazon, and something that Bezos, its founders, other people in that business understood when they came along, is that they had a big advantage over brick and mortar store in terms of what is called the long tail phenomenon. So the less popular books that were not normally found in brick and mortar stores. So anyway, this is something that, again, you take for granted. Maybe you don't think about those issues because you were born and everything was readily available to you, but that explains why, among other things, people moved increasingly to online shopping. And I just want you to understand how things happened in the past, because there will be other revolutions in terms of commerce, transportation, and economic development during your lifetime. And understanding what has happened in the past can perhaps help you anticipate what might happen in the future. Okay, there's maybe one last thing I want to show you. I should have thought of opening it before. Okay, I apologize for the foul language.
No matter
this is
who's
something
making
I'd like you
Americans
to
great, I'm
remember.
50 years old and I'm driving a truck and I'm gonna be happy because there's gonna be 11% growth in the next 5 years. Then all of a sudden, bang, UPS, bang, American Express, Postal Service, Uber, automated, you're all fired. What am I gonna do then? Because I'm sitting here telling you that America's gonna be great and I'm gonna be good forever.
Yeah, I mean, look,
What's gonna happen?
that's going political. Like anybody that thinks the president of the United States, whether it's Barack or Donald or Bernie or Hillary, is gonna help them, they're a fucking loser. Straight up.
Absolutely.
I promise you, you are. That means you need some. So whether your president is for minorities and females, or your president is, for the 26-year-old white male that's got no skills, here's the punchline: the market is the market. What is the 54-year-old gonna do? Adjust or lose.
Right, but how do we get that message out and say, you know what, you can probably drive a truck till you're 55, you can program and tech and do those till you're 90. Talking to BMW, they said that they can't get enough kids to be technicians because their theory is the old mechanic with the big grease on his shirt. I was talking to the head of the heavy machinery operations, meaning crane operators. They said their jobs are empty for 15 months. These kids can go to school for 1 year, come out, make $150,000, but yet they're going to a school. 50% of them will retire with the title of a job that doesn't exist today. They're staying in school for 4 years, half of it is digital classes, they're leaving with $300,000 in debt, and they still don't know how to operate anything. So how do we get the parents in this room to save that money? How do we get the kids in this room, well, not the kids in this room, but who's going to watch this online, to understand what they need to do to move ahead and not think a diploma is going to save me, the president is going to save me, welfare is going to save me, or anything else? What happens then? What needs to happen?
Carnage. Carnage needs to happen. People are complacent. Here's most people's strategies in life.
You hold your breath.
I mean, I really have no passion for this conversation. Like, if you are not capable in 2017 to Google shit and figure out what's going on in the world, fuck you. I'm being dead serious. By the way, I'm being really serious. Like, what role does the government play, or thought leaders, or this and that? Whatever that cliche statement of like the teacher comes when the student is ready, right? I believe in that thing. Like I don't know, like I'm not, lots of things happen. Like lots of things happen in life, right? I woke up one morning and realized, you know what, this liquor shipping law is never gonna get better. There's dirty politician money, they're gonna keep paying this off, and I'm not gonna spend the rest of my life worrying about what the right thing to do is and what's right. No, they're gonna keep paying off politicians state by state, and because I'm the biggest, I'll always be picked on, so I adjusted. I started over. Like, I started over. Like this whole wine library thing, and I got so lucky, guess what? I own 0% of Wine Library because it was under my father's name, so I had no collateral to even start it. I started VaynerMedia by getting somebody to pay me $80,000 to do a marketing campaign, and I built it. And so that's what's gonna happen, and everybody has their version. Not everybody has my business talent to build billion-dollar companies, but if you're making $74,000 or $197,000 or whatever you're making, and your market gets fucked, I don't see truck driver Johnny feeling bad for Rick, the bookstore owner, because Amazon came along. This has happened forever. Isn't that the first time that innovation fucked shit up? Nobody's crying for the farmers in middle America. Nobody's crying for the people in Cleveland who own the docks. This is what always happens. So this is what's up now. And so what 55-year-old Charles has to do when he is out of a job is get another job. Whatever that job is. So if Charles is smart and has skills, he's teaching himself something now to be ready for 3 years from now. But Charles wants to watch football. But Charles wants to drink at the bar.
So he needs to put his 20% into what's going on in the future.
Mister, that's right.
And bank that.
You're damn right.
Okay, so I'll leave you with those happy thoughts. You can bring me your term paper if you have it with you. If you've left it somewhere else, the hard copy needs to be dropped not long after 5 o'clock. Other than that, the questions will be posted shortly. I'll eliminate a few that are remaining in the first part. And good luck, and I'll see you at the final exam.